In the winter of 1896, a set of administrative records, personal diaries, and ecclesiastical reports began to carry a gap that was never filled. This was not a counting error or a fire that destroyed papers. It is about 45 names written, signed, and confirmed that simply ceased to exist from the same date. The case became known decades later as the disappearance of the novices from the Old Cumberland Monastery. The monastery was located on a rocky hill south of the Cumberland region, close to little-used trade routes and far from large urban centers. It was a limestone building darkened by time, built in the first half of the 19th century, originally to house Benedictine monks from Central Europe. By 1896, it was no longer a place of religious prominence, but it remained active as a training center for young novices sent by rural dioceses. Documents from the time describe the place as quiet, austere, and disciplined. There was no electricity. Lighting came from oil lamps and thick, dark wax candles. The main bell marked the hours with almost obsessive precision. The routine began before dawn and ended shortly after sunset. Everything was regulated by the metallic sound echoing through the valley. The 45 novices were between 16 and 24 years old. They came from simple families, mostly farmers, children of miners, sawmill workers, and small traders in the region. For many of these families, the monastery represented not only a religious vocation, but also security, regular meals, and some future within the church. In the registration books, all appear as present and active until the second week of November of that year. The reports of the superiors describe a seemingly normal period. The harvests had been poor, the cold had arrived earlier than expected, and the access road was partially compromised by mud. Still, there is no mention of internal conflicts, serious illnesses, or severe disciplinary punishments. On the contrary, letters exchanged with neighboring dioceses speak of order, exemplary discipline, and productive silence. The monastery had restricted areas, something common for old religious buildings. Among them was a deep basement, sealed by a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron, known on internal maps only as the Old Cellar. Originally used for food storage decades earlier, it was no longer listed as an active area in more recent records. Still, it remained locked, kept under the direct responsibility of the prior. This is where the first strange detail arises. In the maintenance book dated October 1896, there is a brief note, written in handwriting different from the previous ones, informing of the replacement of chains and the reinforcement of the lock on this sealed cellar. There is no explanation, there is no clear signature, just a date and a recorded cost. A few weeks after this note, all 45 novices disappear from the records. There are no transfer certificates. There are no records of escape. There is no mention of mass burials, epidemics, or natural disasters. The monastery continued to function for some time, but never again with the same number of inmates. Some older monks asked to be dismissed. Others were quietly transferred. And in the surviving archives, there is a question that spans more than a century without a clear answer. What happened inside that monastery on the night that 45 young people ceased to exist at the same time without leaving any formal trace? The documents do not scream, they just remain silent. To understand what happened on that November night, it is necessary to go back a few months in time and observe what life was like inside the Old Cumberland Monastery before the records fell silent. The preserved testimonies describe a rigid but predictable routine. The novices woke up while it was still dark, guided by the smaller bell that rang before the first prayer. The stone floor remained cold all year round, and many walked barefoot to the oratory, wrapped in simple habits, worn at the elbows and hem. The air smelled of burnt wax, damp stone, and freshly baked bread from the communal kitchen. During the day, they divided their time between religious studies, manual labor, and maintenance of the monastery itself. Some tended the vegetable garden, others raised chickens and goats. The strongest were assigned to carry firewood or repair exterior walls damaged by rain. Silence was the rule, broken only by readings aloud and instructions from the older monks. Despite the strict discipline, letters sent to their families reveal hopeful young men. Many wrote about the tranquility of the place, about the sense of belonging and purpose. Some mentioned the intense cold, others complained about the simple food, but almost all spoke of the sense of order, as if the outside world were distant and controlled. However, not all accounts are so serene. In a set of notes found years later among the papers of a deceased monk, there are indirect references to a period of growing tension. He writes about prolonged meetings after evening prayer and additional tasks that were not part of the usual schedule. He does not mention names. He does not describe specific orders. He only notes that the novices seemed more tired in the weeks leading up to winter. Some residents of the few houses scattered throughout the valley also left statements in subsequent investigations. One of them reports seeing groups of young people walking at night through the monastery's inner courtyard. Something unusual, since after sunset, everyone was supposed to remain in seclusion. Another mentions metallic sounds coming from inside the hill, like chains being dragged or heavy doors being handled, always late at night. There is also the testimony of a local supplier of flour and salt, who claims to have been instructed not to approach certain areas of the building during his deliveries. He describes a specific corridor near the old wing, always closed, guarded by a monk in absolute silence. According to him, this was not common in previous years. In the administrative records, some subtle changes stand out. The purchase of candles increased significantly that fall. There are also records of extra purchases of oil for lamps and groceries that do not match the official number of residents after October. Bills continue to be paid as if the number of residents remained high. Among the novices themselves, later reports from family members indicate altered behavior during supervised visits. Some young people were quieter. Others avoided eye contact. One mother reports that her son, who had previously been outgoing, just held her hand and asked her to pray for him without explaining why. It was the last time she saw him. None of this, taken alone, seemed alarming. Monasteries were, by nature, places of silence, effort, and discipline. But when these fragments are placed side by side, a discrete, disturbing pattern emerges, almost invisible to those who lived there daily. Something was being prepared. Something that was not in the official books. Something that happened in the intervals of routine, far from public prayers and letters sent to families. And according to the few records that survived, it all converges on the same night. A cold night with no moon visible, when the monastery's largest bell rang outside its usual hours, and was heard by people who should never have been awake at that time. This ringing is not recorded in any book, but it was remembered by more than one witness years later. The night the 45 novices disappeared can only be reconstructed from fragments. There is no continuous account. What we have are loose timelines, faulty memories, and records that begin and stop abruptly. It was the 18th day of November, 1896. The cold had intensified throughout the week. The wind descended from the hill carrying a constant sound, almost a deep lament, which echoed through the stone corridors of the monastery. The lamps had to be lit earlier that afternoon, and the sky remained overcast, heavy, with no stars visible. According to the prayer book, evening prayers took place at the usual time. The novices went to the dormitories after the last reading. Everything seemed normal. There is no record of warnings, punishments, or extraordinary meetings on that specific page. Still, something happened after that. The first clue appears on a wall clock found years later in the East Wing. It had stopped exactly a few minutes after the 11th chime of the night. The mechanism was not broken. It had simply stopped, as if no one had returned to wind it up. Residents of the valley reported in later statements that the main bell rang unusually that night. It was not a long call, nor an emergency warning. It was just two chimes, spaced apart, deep, echoing across the hill. The type of signal used internally to summon specific groups, not the entire community. Inside the monastery, the reconstruction suggests that the novices were awakened one by one, or in small groups. There was no rushing. There were no screams. No witnesses report sounds of panic. Just footsteps. Many footsteps. Barefoot on cold stone. The low sound of habits brushing the floor. The lamps in the old corridor were lit that night, something unusual. The soot found on the walls years later indicates prolonged use, more intense than normal. This corridor led directly to the oldest wing of the building, the same one where the sealed cellar was located. According to a monk who left the order shortly thereafter, and whose testimony was only recorded decades later, there was an unwritten rule. When that door was opened, no one asked questions. He does not explain why. He only says that it was not a matter of curiosity, but of survival within the hierarchy. The cellar door was heavy, reinforced with iron, and made a distinctive sound when unlocked. A low creak, followed by a sharp impact. A local resident claims to have heard something similar that night, even from a distance, mixed with the wind. There are no detailed maps of the interior of the basement in the public archives, only vague references to steep stairs, rough stone walls, and compartments used decades earlier for storage. The space was not designed for prolonged human habitation. It was cold, damp, and without adequate ventilation. What is known with some certainty is that from that moment on, the novices no longer appear in any active records. The attendance book for the following morning was not filled out. The following pages remain blank for days. The last concrete evidence is an object found much later, during an informal inspection, when the monastery was already partially abandoned. A small, simple wooden crucifix, showing signs of wear, still attached to a piece of worn string. It was on the floor, near the base of the stairs leading to the basement. There was no blood. There were no visible signs of a struggle. Just that object, out of place. None of the 45 young people were ever seen again outside the monastery walls. There are no records of any trips. No residents of nearby towns reported groups walking along the roads. No bodies were found in the woods, rivers, or trails in the area. It is as if they all crossed an invisible line that night, a point beyond which the documents do not advance, and history refuses to continue in a clear manner. The silence begins right there. The next morning dawned without fanfare. The smaller bell did not ring at the usual time. The courtyard remained empty longer than normal. One of the monks responsible for the kitchen recorded, in a loose note found years later, that the bread prepared that morning was left over in unusual quantities. The sentence ends without explanation. Only hours later did anyone officially notice the collective absence. Records indicate initial confusion, followed by a rapid effort at containment. Gates were kept closed. Visitors were not received that day. A messenger was sent to the nearest diocese, but there is no copy of the message in the archives. What exists is only the response, dated days later, requesting a detailed and immediate report. That report has never been located. Valley residents began to notice changes in the monastery's behavior. The lamps remained lit during the day. The largest bell stopped ringing for an extended period. Older monks began to avoid eye contact when they crossed paths with outside workers. Deliveries continued, but in smaller volumes and always supervised. When families began to ask about their children, the response was always vague. There was talk of temporary transfers, of internal missions, of vows of prolonged silence. None of these explanations were accompanied by official documents, something unusual, even by the standards of the time. External pressure increased when a relative insisted on visiting the site and was prevented from entering. The case reached local authorities weeks later, but in a fragmented manner, without a clear, formal complaint. The police chief responsible noted in his notebook that the matter involves the church and should be treated with caution. Even so, a superficial inspection was carried out. It took place during the day, accompanied by members of the monastery itself. No thorough search was conducted. The old areas remained closed. The final report mentions empty dormitories, organized belongings, and no obvious signs of violence. It coldly concludes that there was no immediate evidence of a crime. The most disturbing detail appears in an internal diocese document dated months later. It contains an explicit recommendation that the monastery be gradually decommissioned as a training center. The text refers to serious administrative failures, poor management of inmates, and the need to avoid new scandals. There is no direct mention of the 45 novices. Over the years, some monks left the order. 2 of them died shortly thereafter according to civil records. A third moved to another region and never spoke publicly about Cumberland again. Only once, in a private letter, did he write the phrase, "There are doors that cannot be opened twice without consequences." No official excavation was carried out in the basement while the monastery was still active. When decades later, the abandoned building was partially explored by local authorities, the old cellar was found to be completely sealed from the inside. The stairs had been removed. The entrance was filled with rubble and stones, as if someone had made a point of blocking access. There were no visible bodies. There were no clear signs of burial. The revelation that emerges, cold and human, is simple and devastating. The disappearance was not a sudden accident, nor a collective escape. It was a process conducted in silence, protected by hierarchies, fear, and the institutional convenience of not looking in certain places. The 45 did not disappear because no one knew. They disappeared because many knew, and chose not to record it. Decades passed before the name of the Old Cumberland Monastery reappeared in regional historical studies. When it did, there were no longer any direct witnesses alive. All that remained were yellowed papers, margins corroded by time, and interrupted sentences as if they had been written in haste or in fear. The researcher who gathered the archives in the late 20th century describes the feeling of working with this material as listening to a story told only by the pauses. There are no confessions. There are no complete narratives. What exists are meticulously preserved absences, records that continue normally until the exact point where they should explain something and choose not to. The monastery, officially abandoned at the beginning of the following century, was gradually taken over by time. The roof collapsed in parts. Moisture opened cracks in the walls. Vegetation advanced through the inner courtyard. Even so, the old wing remained closed for many years, as if the building itself resisted being completely exposed. Older residents of the region avoided the subject. When questioned, they responded with short sentences, always in the past tense, always with distance. Some simply said that it was not something to be touched. Others claimed that, at that time, certain decisions were not discussed. None of them mentioned ghosts, legends, or divine punishment. The weight was always on the people, never on the invisible. In the diocese's archives, there is a list of names marked as discontinued interns. 45 lines. No additional comments. No departure dates. No causes. It is the only place where they all appear together after their disappearance. Not as victims, not as deceased, just interrupted. The historian concludes his report with an observation that does not appear in official documents, but emerges as an inevitable reflection. Institutions do not need to destroy bodies to erase existences. It is enough to reorganize the silence, control the records, and allow time to do the rest of the work. The Old Cumberland Monastery is now just a discrete ruin, occasionally visited by curious people who are unaware of most of its history. There are no explanatory plaques. There is no memorial. The site has not been officially associated with any recognized tragedy. And perhaps that is precisely what makes the case so heavy. 45 young people entered there believing in purpose, order, and the future. They left the documents as if they had never passed through those gates. They left no descendants. They left no final letters. They left no graves. What remains is an empty space between lines of files, and the uncomfortable certainty that, in certain periods of history, disappearing did not require visible violence, just enough silence. And silence, when well managed, can last more than a century.